is now in an all-out war with Hamas. According to the nation's defense minister, Palestinian officials have reported well over 350 people killed and more than 1,000 wounded so far. This is the third straight day of airstrikes in Gaza. The U.S. has called on Hamas to halt the ongoing rocket fire on Israel. The United Nations Secretary General is urging an immediate ceasefire on both sides and calling Israel's use of force excessive. Protesters have gathered in cities all around the world, from Paris to London and beyond, outraged at the Israeli airstrikes. My question tonight is, this is the 21st century. Are we ever going to get beyond the cycle of violence, revenge, and still more violence in the Middle East? When is the whole world going to stand up and say, enough? Here to hash it out, a fantastic panel. Joe Pagliarulo, who we know as Joe Pags, who hosts San Antonio's First News Radio 1200 WOAI. Lisa Schirch, professor of peace building at Eastern Mennonite University, and James Phillips, senior fellow at Heritage Foundation. Joe Pags, I want to start with you. Israel says it's very sorry that it has killed children while it tries to do targeted airstrikes against Hamas militants. But how can you do targeted airstrikes in an area that is twice the size of Washington, D.C., that contains 1.5 million people? I mean, come on, that's like saying we're going to do targeted airstrikes in Midtown Manhattan. Of course you're going to hit civilians, and they have, including kids.
Well, it's a good question, Jane, but at some point we have to ask the question, when is enough enough? If you've got rockets flying into Israel, what exactly should they do? Hamas and Hezbollah and these terrorist organizations, whether it's a government or not there in the West Bank, in Gaza, these groups hide behind women and children. What should you do? Just let them keep on launching rockets? Hey, look, some more rockets today. And the UN saying it's excessive. Okay, UN, what should Israel do? Okay, here's a rocket for you. Oh, here comes another rocket. I'll send you another rocket. I think Israel's going in and trying to end this, okay? You're going to keep on sending rockets since the ceasefire on December 19th. We're going to go in and show you what can happen if you keep this garbage up. Boom, boom, boom. Knock it off, and we'll knock it off. I think they did the right thing here.
Well, listen, I got to tell you, I think Hamas definitely deserves blame. I mean, it's idiotic. They're hitting Israel with rockets, but a lot of these rockets are homemade, and they've done relatively minimal damage compared certainly to this onslaught. Since the beginning of 2008, 17 people have been killed by the Hamas rockets in Israel, 9 of them civilians. And yeah, they deserve a lot of blame. They refused to extend the peace agreement that they had with Israel, essentially a ceasefire. They are provoking Israel. But nevertheless, this response, Lisa Schirch, is what they call shock and awe, Israeli style. And didn't we find out during the Iraq War, shock and awe doesn't work at the end of the day? It simply inspires people to become more violent. With every person that's killed, the entire family of that person turns into radical militants?
Absolutely. And I think what we need to remember are the words of General Petraeus about Iraq when he said there is no military solution. The solution is economic and political. And I think that same wisdom that General Petraeus gave for the situation in Iraq is true also here for Gaza, because while most Americans are friends and supporters of Israel, we haven't found a way as a nation to be both pro-Israel and pro-peace. And so I think we need to find a new way forward in our relationship with this whole region to greatly increase our understanding of the root causes of this conflict, because the story doesn't start just with the cycle of violence of the rockets going into Israel and now the counterattack by Israel against Gaza. The story starts with the whole region of Gaza being like a prison with a humanitarian disaster, and just like a cat being cornered, the desperation, the sense of humiliation, the frustration and despair there is so great that's until that situation is dealt with, it's hard to see a way out of this. So I think that, you know, for the U.S. and Israel, a better strategy for Israeli security and security for the whole region is to think about dealing finally with the root causes of the situation rather than this tit for tat that we see now.
Well, James Phillips, I mean, what are we going to do? The United States has signed an agreement to give Israel $30 billion over the next decade. That's approximately $3 billion a year. Can money be tied to a policy of nonviolence?
I don't think money should be tied to such a policy. I think such a policy would be a disaster when an ally is up against a terrorist organization that is wedded to violence. to try to limit them to a nonviolent response, I think, would be courting disaster. And Lisa mentioned General Petraeus in Iraq, and General Petraeus has led an unrelenting struggle against al-Qaeda in Iraq and has distinguished between the irreconcilable terrorist elements that he must deal with.
Well, look, I understand what you're saying, but I'm looking at a big picture. I'm not involved in the strategy of war. I'm actually more interested in the strategy of peace. You know, doing the same thing over and over again and expecting a different result, that is the definition of insanity. We live in a global village right now, Joe Pags, where basically the entire world sees everything that goes on. And judging from the demonstrations, this is a public relations disaster in some levels.
Well, I got to tell you something. Let's not fall for the propaganda that comes out of Hamas or even Hezbollah. The last time something like this happened, it's propaganda. They've got 2,000 people marching in countries that have millions and millions of people. Kids are holding signs in Venezuela that were handed to them by somebody from the government. I'm sure the kids are smiling as they say no more bombing in Gaza.
All right, we're going to hold it right there, but we're going to be back with more in just a moment. We're back with our fabulous panel talking about the Israeli airstrikes on Gaza. Joe Pags, President-elect Obama is not really weighing in. He's saying there's only one president at a time. But let's face it, he campaigned successfully on a mantra of change, and he is also considered an anti-war candidate. That was how he first made his name, was being in opposition to the Iraq war. So what can he do to change the dynamic? I understand that, yes, they had to do something. But listen, we've been down this road before. We just did this in Lebanon a couple of years ago. This is a new century. Can't we come up with new alternatives than just bombing the hell out of civilian areas?
I think it's an interesting question. You know, actually, President-elect Barack Obama sounded like George W. Bush today. I saw a quote, and I'll paraphrase it, where he said, hey, if somebody keeps throwing rockets into my backyard, I'm going to do everything I can to stop that from happening. So he kind of sounded like he likes war. I almost agree with him, Jane, if you can believe that. But no, I mean, some sort of a change has to happen, but it has to happen at the end of violence. I think that Israel's response here is big enough and bad enough that maybe Hamas and the Palestinians and Egypt and Jordan can finally say, okay, wait a second. I remember George W. Bush said we should make a Palestinian state. Why don't we go back and revisit that?
Right. The Arab states are getting together, Lisa Schirch, to discuss this. What is their responsibility in trying to come up with a peaceful solution so we don't keep doing this over and over again?
Well, absolutely. As I said before, Gaza is like a prison, and they have no way out. They have no passports. They can go nowhere. So I think that we absolutely need to, as in the United States, put pressure and along with the international community for the entire region to deal with the crisis in Gaza, because it's not just Israel's fault. It's the entire region and the history of what's happened with the Palestinian people. But I think that we do need to be thinking about the next steps, and we need an immediate diplomatic surge. So sending people over immediately along with the international community to get another ceasefire between Hamas and Israel.
And then, you know what, I want to jump in here, because to me, it's almost like money could solve all this. We spend billions, and all these weapons cost many, many billions. And yet the problem, as you're mentioning, is partially poverty. I mean, 1/3 of the Gazans live in refugee camps. Half of the population, according to the UN Secretary General, is under 18. We're talking about kids here. We could give them a lot of money, and we could say, hey, turn your area into a resort. It would probably cost the same as it would to bomb and wreak the havoc that we're wreaking here. Listen, I want to thank my entire panel. We are out of time, but we're going to continue to discuss this day after day, obviously. I'm Jane Velez Mitchell, and you're watching Issues on HLN.